Hello, everyone. I'm Laura Greiner, your host for today's Swine podcast. And with me today, I have Dr. Marissa Hake, who is the Director of Animal Welfare and Sustainability with Fairlife. Marissa, how are you today?
I am doing well. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast.
Well, glad to have you here today. Well, Marissa, some of our audience members may not be very familiar with you. So before we jump into our topic today, would you mind giving a little bit of background about yourself?
Yeah, I would love to. So like you said, I'll kind of work backwards. So my current role is the Director of Animal Welfare and Sustainable Farming for Fairlife, where I really manage all of our animal welfare governance programs for any of our supplying farms and then any of our farm sustainability projects. And so I kind of consider my boots on the ground in two different places. So, I get to be boots on the ground with our supplying dairy farmers and then boots on the ground within our entire organization and brand in our supply chain. So, talking about what's going on with our farms within our company and then out to obviously our stakeholders and customers. And so I really enjoy it. I get to use my veterinary skills, but then also my communication skills, which is something that I'm really passionate about. And so I went to Michigan State. I did my undergrad in animal science there, my veterinary degree, and then my master's in public health. So I bleed green if there's any Spartans on here. Not a huge swine school. So I think I was one of two people that was kind of interested in going to swine. I knew, I had a strong dairy background, obviously being from Michigan, but I really just loved food animals. So I was interested in either poultry or swine or cattle. And so I did a couple swine internships and always got my butt kicked by the Iowa kids or the Minnesota kids, but we hold our own at Michigan State. So when I graduated, I actually took on the role of staff veterinarian for Midwest deal. So we had a large calf operation in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. So really managed the health and welfare of around 60,000 calves of milk at a time. And that's really, where I kind of developed my love and desire for communicating about agriculture and sharing what's happening on our farms, and then building out an animal welfare program for a company that didn't have any animal welfare program and never had a veterinarian on staff. So it was really great. I really learned a lot through that experience, and it really helped open the doors to where I'm at right now.
Well, some of our audience is international and they may not be very familiar with Fairlife. So could you give just a little snippet about what Fairlife or who Fairlife is and what they do?
Yeah. I love Fairlife because one, it was actually developed by dairy farmers and a dairy veterinarian, which I think is just so cool. We have an ultra filtered milk product, and I kind of consider it like water going through a Brita filter, right? So we figured out how to take out the lactose out of milk and put it back together and make this wonderful higher protein, lower sugar product. That's what we market. We have protein shakes and ice cream and milk. And we actually brought, a lot of people back to dairy because they're lactose intolerant. And I think it's one of the very few brands that's really drove innovation in the fluid milk sector.
I think that's really interesting because I'm sure we have some listeners right now who are probably going, why does a swine podcast have a dairy person on?
Yeah.
And we talk a lot about that, right? There's many things we can learn across our species and our different commodities. And so I think today you'll have some really good insight for our producers, especially the discussion piece around, how you've taken a product and made it fit into a group of consumers that we didn't really think could ever consume your product, right? When we talk about milk, nobody thinks that anybody with a lactose issue could consume milk. And so here we have a product that's available.
I think it's super important that we always, I'm married to a farmer. I get it. I work with farmers every single day, right? And we're putting out fires. We're doing it day to day. But I think the beauty of my role is that I really get to step back and zoom out and work with a brand that's always engaging with the customer and consumer and saying, what do you want? What do you need from us? And as a farmer, I think we need to consider that. And when we're looking out, 5, 10, 20 years down the road, at the end of the day, we all make consumer products. So we need to know what the consumer wants from us, right? And we have to accept what they want or what they have to say. So, keeping that in the balance of, obviously farmers are the experts in what we're doing and we know best. but we are making consumer goods. So what do we need to give them at the end of the day that makes us both happy and profitable?
Absolutely. And I think you bring up some really good points, and we'll kind of jump in if you will, if you don't
Mhm.
mind.
Yeah.
I sat in a meeting last week and I heard someone talk about, oh, of course, as we've all heard, the differences between the baby boomers, the Gen Xers, the millennials, the Gen Zs. And so from your perspective today, how are consumers changing? I mean, one of the things I've actually heard is in today's household, it's the children that are driving the purchases at the grocery store more so than the parents making that decision. So it's really our children that are decision makers in what we purchase versus ourselves. But what are you seeing in terms of the consumer change and discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I'm honestly, I think about all the time and I'm really passionate about because, I think when I first got into agriculture, we talked about most of our consumers are at least 2 years generations removed from the farm, right? And you keep hearing that. But I think if we redid that study, we'd probably find out that most of our consumers are now probably 4 to 5 years removed from the farm, which is an even bigger difference. They don't even have a grandpa they knew that farmed, right? And so I think that's one perspective to think about. And then two is you're exactly right. I kind of always had this slide when I talk is it's not your father's consumer, right? So our consumers have changed so much, and what they find valuable has changed so much. There's a really good study. I'd have to pull it up, but it kind of just shows. It was asking, boomers versus Gen Xers is, what's important to you? Is animal welfare important to you? Is environmental sustainability important to you? All social responsibility questions. And I mean, as kids get older, it increases, right? And so the boomers are like, I don't care. And then it increases. And it's just a great graph to show like this is something that's on top of mind for consumers. And I think if anybody doesn't believe it, then go see a brand that's had a scandal, right? Or, a manure spill or something that's been big issue. And you can see just how much it will impact a brand or a farm. And so understanding that they are making purchasing decisions based on these kind of social things now, these social responsibilities that were never of consideration before is really important.
Man, I think you bring up a good point. I was doing a little bit of just watching TV this weekend, and I came across a reality TV show, which I'm not really into, but I caught a bit of it, and I actually had a giggle because they were out in the woods, and somebody had brought a deer, and these were individuals who came from the city, and they were showing them how to process a deer in the woods, and they were having them break down the carcass, and they came to the ribs, and they were cutting them down, and the person's eyes lit up, and they're like, I didn't realize that the ribs I ate came from the ribs of an animal, right? And I have, if you're in farming and you're in agriculture,
Yeah.
you laugh and you giggle, but that reality is really there. So
Mhm.
what I kind of always question back with the consumer is, how do they know how to create their social responsibility checklist or priority list if they have no concept of what agriculture really is?
Yeah, and I think that comes back to building trust. So I think there's two kind of camps within ag communication is one is education, right? Like we're just going to educate the consumer so they can make the right choice. And I don't sit in that camp. I don't think that today's consumer wants to be educated. They don't care. I mean, they don't have the time for it, right? They're making a quick decision in the grocery store. And so, or, off of what they see on Instagram or something like that. And so for me, it's really trying to build trust. How can we build trust with the consumer so that they think and trust us to do the right thing all the time? And that's really, how trust, it's a trust pyramid, but anyway, a scale of social responsibility and social trust. But as they continue to see things that they don't understand or don't like on our farms, we erode our trust with our consumers, right? And so we really need to be working on building that back with them. And so that when they go to either one, vote, or two, make a purchasing decision, which both those things are scary, right? That they feel like I trust this person. They have what's best in mind for me and the animals that they raise, and here's why I'm going to vote or purchase this way. And so that's really the only way that I think that we're going to win back consumers.
I think that's an interesting concept. I still struggle sometimes, though, when you do have conversations with people who aren't involved in agriculture, and maybe we're talking about physical castration of an animal, and from their viewpoint, it's wrong, it's bad. And so, without that education piece, how do you
Mhm.
get them to quote trust that what we're doing is correct? Because I still feel like, just like you said, I feel there's a disconnect really between the ability to educate and the ability to trust, because they are so overwhelmed with information and they are trying to make quick decisions. They're not going to necessarily research all the reasons why. They just
Yeah.
personify that and say, "Oh, that's bad," right?
Yeah.
So how do we work through that process?
That's a great point. And I think there is a subset of consumers that do want that education. So we for sure have to have it for them. I think for the rest of the ones that just want to feel good with what's on package or, making that decision is knowing a farmer within the organization, right, is really, really helps. People really want to make connections with humans. So if they can feel like they know a farmer or they know, someone within their community, that's the biggest win. And then having verification, right? So maybe they don't trust you because you are a farmer, and obviously it's in your interest to you're going to make all this money, right? And so having a verification, so a third party verification is really helpful. And then you can also have that verification on pack. And most people do have high trust scores with those types of marketing strategies. So they're saying, yes, this is what they believe in, but then there's also a third party verification that comes in and says that they're actually doing those things.
So that's something that this consumer is currently looking for, is those validations from somebody who's not necessarily tied to that company, to feel like
Correct.
what's being requested of them is being heard.
Yeah. And, there's always going to be that mistrust. And I get that sometimes. They're like, well, you've been bought out by Big Ag, and I'm like, I'm still waiting on my check from Big Ag, but okay. So those third party verifications are valuable.
Absolutely. So let's kind of flip this a little bit. So as a company, or as a representative of a company, if you're doing some of this discussion with your supply chain, and whether that's the grocery store or directly with the consumer, and you start to hear a message that's being repeated and repeated, it sounds like this is something that your business needs to really listen to and figure out how to address. How do you start that process of saying, okay, this is what the consumer wants? How does this fit our business model? How do we economically validate this decision? Where do we start in that process?
Yeah, that's a great question, because that's really what I kind of do. Part of my day is really zooming out and saying, okay, here are the 3 or 4 things that people have a real concern about with dairy, right? So for us, we have to win in environmental sustainability. We know that, and we're going to, right? And so working in that area, and then really there's 2 buckets for me. It's animal welfare and sustainability. And so when I skip over to the animal welfare portion, it's like, okay, so what are these 3 big topic areas that we need to work on as an industry? What's happening with our calves, and access to pasture and outdoor access. So there's these kind of 4 or 5 different buckets that I'm thinking about, because they're continually coming to mind. And then within that, it's like, okay, so in the next 5 to 10 years, where are we at with research right now? What is there areas that we need to build out for research? Talking to our farmers, because I think our farmers are probably the biggest place of innovation, right? And figuring out things that they're doing on farm is pretty amazing. And putting it in their bucket, is these are the areas that we're looking at in the next 5 to 10 years. So start thinking, right? And then working beyond the research and starting innovation at the farm is developing a plan for our supply chain within the US or whatever country that we're in, and what that looks like. And so whether it's phase outs or it's just like I said, building out research or doing pilot farms or things like that, that's really how we kind of initiate the ball. And I think the part that we miss often as a brand is sharing what we learned, right? So everything isn't going to be successful. And I think consumers understand that. But I think if you say, hey, in 2020, we did, here's our learnings, here's what we learned, that this doesn't work. It actually, we had a reduction in animal welfare. So that's why we're not going to do this anymore. That's why we're not going to go with that technology. That holds a lot of weight with consumers if you can explain how you came to that decision. And so, yeah, I guess I'll end there.
No, you're fine. You can keep going if you'd like, if there's
No,
anything
that's,
else.
I think that's just how you build out a program. And it's a really a long-term partnership with, your consumers and your customers, what they're looking at, your farms, and then you as a brand or a company and what, you want to work on. And so I think it's really important that farmers understand that it really is a partnership, right? We can't do this alone. So
How do you handle the consumer that comes to you and hey, they're somewhat educated, they've read a few things and they say, oh, this is what I'm concerned about. And maybe they pick on a specific topic when really it's the broader picture, right? So the angle of the consumer is a little bit different. They're thinking it's probably more, maybe it's a welfare aspect, but they picked on, one pinpoint of what happens in the dairy industry. Maybe it's the pastures. So how do
Mhm.
you interpret that information and really try to ask what is the real issue at hand for the consumer?
Yes. I'll tell you what you should do. It's probably not what I do, but what you should do is say, tell me more, say more. What do you know about that already? Or, why is that why is that a concern? So just really understanding, and getting to the bottom of the question. And I'll give an example. So this weekend, we went over to our friend's pond party and there was, some city folk there and they were talking about dairy. We were talking about dairy. So I said, I work for a dairy company. I'm really proud, blah, blah, blah. And she said, well, is that why my daughter had her period at 10 years old? And I was like, okay, here we go,
There
and
you
so
go.
just, and then just said, say more, so what is the thing, and then we talked about, I said, what happens when my cows mature really well because I fed them really well? It's a nutrition thing, right? So people mature faster when they have really good access to food and nutrition. And we talked about how blessed we are to be in America and have this amazing food supply, right? And so, we talked about how there are no hormones in milk, added hormones, and how things the milk hasn't changed since, the 60s and 70s. So really it is a nutrition thing. And having those really good conversations, but be willing to have those conversations with people and not get abrasive and be like, well, you're stupid,
Yes, yeah. And I like that phrase, tell me more, because I think that exactly does, it keeps that conversation open. It helps that individual feel like they can share and not put you on maybe quite the defensive that maybe in your mind you are, but verbally you're not expressing it. And that's the important thing, to get them to really talk about what's concerning them.
Yeah, and I don't think our farmers they don't want to have those conversations. They're hard, they're sensitive, right? They're emotional. People are emotional about food. We
Mhm.
all eat and it really does impact us, right? And so is if there's someone within your organization who's passionate about it, then encouraging them to be that way and giving them resources to even talk within your communities, or doing a farm tour here, then even if it's for your church Bible study or something, a safe group, right, that can kind of help broaden that message. But we really need to be I think better communicators as what's happening on our farms.
You brought up a phrase a little while ago, and I'm going to come back to it now. You talked about being part of big ag, right? Somebody thinking you were part of big ag. And
Mm-hmm.
again, that word, that phrase creates mistrust within the consumer population. So being part of a company who some consumers have put you into that bucket, who do you select from your company to serve as the representative, right? Who from that company are they going to be more likely to trust? If they already have this sense of, oh, they may not be a trustworthy group to start with. I'm not saying that about Fairlife, but just that
Yeah.
perception of being part of big ag.
No, I don't know if I'm going to answer this the right way for you, but I did a video one time in one of our cattle barns. So we raise cattle, backgrounder cattle. They end up at JBS, but we also do direct to consumer. So our neighbors could be consuming our beef, or our neighbors who go to Walmart could be consuming our beef, right? And so we talked about in this video, I'm out there, I'm actually holding like my 2-year-old, and I'm like, I'm a mom, I feed this to my children as well. But the cattle that you see here, this is a CAFO. This is a concentrated animal feeding operation. That is how we're designated. And but in contrast, if you think we're a factory farm, then yes, I guess we are. But here's what happens here, right? Like these animals go direct to consumer. We're that small local, and then we're also a national. We go to a national brand, right? Because we sell to Walmart, and so I think having kind of those talking about how you can have both, right? You can have this family farm that also helps feed everyone in the country, right? And so I guess that's kind of how I always try to frame it is communicating in a way that people can relate, right? People can relate that I'm a mom and I feed my kids and that I'm a local town, but then I also want to work with a brand. And so I don't know if that answered your question right, but that's kind of the way I try to frame it.
I don't think there's a right answer. I
Yeah.
don't have a quiz for you today. So we're just kind of talking. But yeah, that I think you're absolutely right when we think about where the consumer is and the social responsibility, the emotion and whether it's being a parent or working with your neighbors. I think that does connect with them, right? That is something that they can adhere to. And certainly we've done the surveys post COVID about how well they trust a scientist versus trusting their neighbor, and we certainly have seen that shift, whether it was due to COVID or just due to generational shifts. It's more pronounced today. And I actually do put veterinarians in that category as well, right? Because you are focused on animal health and people can relate to you because you are a doctor, but yet you're concerned about their animal. And again, we think about animals and the relationship to our individuals. It's a huge factor, right? So I would probably put you in there as well as being a veterinarian, just in your profession and how you relate to consumer. But is that what you see today, or is it different?
No, I think you're right. There's this trust scale. I think Edelman does it. I can't remember. And veterinarians always rank very, very high on that. I mean, there's like used car salesmen, and then we go up the scale, nurses. I think we're right below, usually below doctors and nurses, which is really encouraging. So, yeah, veterinarians are always is highly trusted, and usually they're kind of neutral territory, right? Because at the end of the day, we have made a vow that we always kind of put animals first, right? And our consumers know that, and so I think it's really important for veterinarians to work with their producers and make sure that we're all on the same page, right? And help communicate that, because they really are. And I think too, for producers to have that relationship, because when something goes wrong, right, that's who you're going to call, and that's who you're probably going to want on your team when you're discussing what happened, what actions are we going to take going forward, is you really want a veterinarian on your team. And so to have that person beforehand is always good as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, what if something does go wrong? How do we address that with the consumer, whether it's a manure spill today or, a video that unfortunately comes out that maybe isn't in the right context? How do we help assure the consumer of where we're at?
Yeah, that's a great point. And, there's kind of the day one stuff, which is ensuring that your food's safe, right? I mean, that's the number one concern. And then two is the actions that you're going to take going forward, and being very upfront with that, and giving them an expectation of timelines of, this is what we're doing today. By the end of the week, we'll have this done, and and kind of taking them on that journey with you. But then also saying and reinforcing whatever fears that they might have in that video is, kind of, if it's a manure spill, environmental considerations are always top of mind for us, and just reinforcing what we believe in as a organization, or as an industry for sure. So and then working through that and communicating out the steps that you've taken along the way. So that's kind of the scary part about it, is going out there and saying, we did this, we had this accident, this thing happened, and we don't want to bring it up again, but we want to make sure that that we did these things, right? And so I think that is walking them through the steps taken afterwards.
Yeah. And that's kind of how I take it. So I was just kind of writing some notes, and I caught a couple of things. So we acknowledge the issue, we take action, we communicate both that we acknowledge the issue and that we're taking actions, and then we do some assurance on how do we prevent this in the future, right? Those are really the four things that our consumer probably needs to know or wants to know. Would that be fair, or am I missing a step?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. And I think having anything preformed before anything happens is these are our, this is what we believe in as whether a co-op or, a brand or whatever, so that you can reinforce those as they come out is, these are really our guiding principles in this area. We'll always come back to these, and, and making sure you can have that up front.
Absolutely. Those are great. The other thing that I also think or picked up on your conversation was the having a timeline. And what popped into my head was really bullet points. Some of the recent research I've read is that today's generation really only wants something in about 30 words or less. To really retain it, to read it, after you get about that far, they're done. Is that something you're seeing today too, as far as if we're going to tell that story, we don't want to get too far in the weeds, just keep it very short and brief, or do they want all the extra?
Yeah, I think you're going to have multi-stakeholders, right? So you're going to have that detailed list of everything you've done and resources and links and all of that, right? But if you're trying to communicate, say on social media, yes, you need to keep it very brief. It could be, multiple points of each one is kind of a bullet point, here's our beliefs, here's our actions, because that's really all you're going to see. You're competing with everything else, right? Like everything else is flashy and shiny. And so if you're going to try to make a point, definitely distill it down. And I know us millennials and younger get a bad rap for that, but we have a lot coming at us every single day. And so we need to make sure that we are delivering it in a way that our consumers are looking for it to be delivered. And that really is kind of distilled into the point.
Absolutely. Well, I see our time's kind of wrapping up. Marissa, are there any key points or takeaways that you'd like our audience to be thinking about today?
Yeah, just every once in a while, maybe when you're driving a tractor or something, like zoom out a little bit and think, what do I need for my farm in the next 5-10 years? And what are consumers thinking about? And have a relationship with your veterinarian, because I always encourage that. I think those are my big two things.
Those are great takeaways. I appreciate those, Marissa. Mm-hmm. But as we wrap up, we'd like to ask our guest speakers just a couple of different questions. The first question we like to ask is, do you have a favorite swine resource book? Now, I know you're not the swine person because I see lots of dairy cattle in your backdrop there, but how about something from an animal welfare or behavior side?
Yes. So I've read my books for this. So I have Improving Animal Welfare, 3rd edition, a practical approach from Dr. 𝗪𝗵𝘁. And I really appreciate this because she really does take a kind of a practical approach to things. And so I really like this resource.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great resource.
And it's pigs. It has pigs on the front.
I saw that too. She's still got her pigs in there.
Yeah.
Well, how about something that's not related to pigs? Is there another resource that you'd recommend to our audience today?
Yeah, so this is not animal welfare or anything related, but it's the current book that I'm reading, which is CEO Excellence. And so I just really like this book. I haven't finished it yet, but it's kind of the mindsets that distinguish leaders from the rest. And I think if you're owning a farm and you're leading people, you're managing people, that type of mentality is always super important. So you don't have to be leading a company. You could just be leading, a team. And I think it's a good resource.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds like a good book. I have not read that one yet. Well, the last question really kind of fits into that a little bit. If you can think of someone in your life, either still living or has passed on, that you've defined as successful, and you get to define success however you view it, what would be a key trait or characteristic that they have that you think's allowed them to be successful?
Yes, this is for multiple people that have, in my life that I think have been successful, and that's really empathy. So I really, truly believe that the best leaders and most successful people in my life really embrace that empathy and want to help build out others within their teams, right? So not just themselves. And so the only way that you can do that is, your teammates or your everyone feel kind of engaged, and that really does take empathy. And so I guess that's my trait.
That's a great one. I haven't heard that one yet. So that's a really good trait for someone to have. Well, Marissa, our time is up. I do want to thank you again so much for our visit today. I greatly appreciate it. For our audience who is listening, this is Dr. Marissa Hake, who is with Fairlife. Thank you, Marissa.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Imagine if, with a few key concepts, you could have the potential to create a massive positive impact by bringing from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars for swine producers. Join us on this small group and go to the next level of swine nutrition on this 7-week-long elite online training in applied swine nutrition and feeding by myself and my world-class invited speakers. Additionally, you enjoy an exclusive community to exchange ideas. Go now to www.eliteswinenutritionist.com.